Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Tannenbaum. I'm the Technical Product Manager for Virtual Production here at Unity. And with me is Greg LeBute. Hey, Greg.
Hey, Mark.
So Gregory is like, if you've used Cinemachine, you've hung out at all at the Cinemachine forum, you know Gregory because he is super active there, giving everyone advice and helping them figure out their problems. He probably knows at this point Cinemachine better than anybody on the planet. is just somebody
possibly in the known universe.
Yeah. So he is really the only and best person to be here to talk about what we're going to talk about today, and that is Cinemachine 3. So this is a major version of Cinemachine. Greg, why don't you talk to us about why it's time for a version 3 of Cinemachine?
Right. So Cinemachine has been in the Unity family for at least 5 years. And in the beginning, it was an acquired product, which means it was something that was designed already. And from the beginning, it never really felt like something that fit neatly into the rest of Unity. It was designed with its own idiosyncrasies built in. And since that time, Unity has evolved. Things like nested prefabs, things like presets, and ongoing UI upgrading for Unity is leaving Cinemachine a little bit behind. And if we want to play nicely with this stuff, at a certain point, we're going to have to step back and redesign the way some of the things were done. And we thought now would be a good time to do that. So really what Cinemachine 3 is all about, it's not so much a change of content, but it's more a change of format. So we're doing all the same stuff. We're not really bringing in any new features. There are a couple of little things, but mostly it's the same feature set as before, but it's implemented in a way that's much more in line with the way the rest of Unity does things. So that means API is going to change. And because the API is changing, that's why we have to bump this up to a major revision number. It's not just a small update. The data format's going to change. The API is going to change. The game object structure is going to change. There's a whole bunch of things like that. I can go into a little bit of detail. We're integrating better with Unity standards. So that means that there are no more hidden game objects. You might not know this, but Cinemachine was implemented using hidden game objects that held the behaviors that were responsible for doing the aim, controlling the orientation of the camera, controlling the position of the camera. Those 3 sections in the inspector, aim, body, and noise, were actually implemented using hidden game objects under the hood with hidden behaviors on them. And that necessitated quite a complex API to get at these things and animate them and access them from your scripts. So we're cleaning all that up. It's becoming much more standardized. And because of that, it's going to play a lot better with prefabs. It's going to play a lot better with presets as well. Cinemachine was written using a standard for member variables, which was m underscore whatever the name is. We've gotten a lot of complaints about that. None of us liked it. So finally, since we're doing an upgrade anyway, we've just decided to bite the bullet and remove all those m underscore things. So that's another significant change in the API.
Right. So there's a lot of changing of names and standardizing names. I will note, I believe that there's also the point about renaming the virtual camera, since Unity now has another product called Virtual Camera. So we're renaming that. So there's various things to kind of help align it, remove confusion. It will, of course, create a little confusion for people who have been in the family for a long time. But it will overall, over the long haul, it will make things a lot cleaner and easier for everyone, right?
That's right. It's really about less confusion in the future, but the small cost of that is that there's going to be some confusion in the present while we make the changeover. And unfortunately, third-party tutorials that are out there, well, they're going to have to get translated into the new language. The language isn't hugely different, but as you say, things have been renamed. So that might cause a little bit of confusion for a little while.
So let's talk about who this is for, right? So we've got this new version, but you pointed out that it's relatively featureless. So what's the implication of that for, say, people who have a project in flight today? Do they need to upgrade to Cinemachine 3?
Well, nobody actually needs to upgrade. We're very conscious of that, and the last thing we want to do is to create a situation where, oh well, Unity is doing some cleanup, and now we're going to make everybody do a lot of work to upgrade their stuff. We're avoiding that route deliberately, and we're going to continue to support Cinemachine 2 for some time into the future. Really enough time so that people who are using Cinemachine 2 can continue to use Cinemachine 2. So because it's not necessarily an effortless job to upgrade, we would recommend, if your project is making any significant use of the Cinemachine API from the scripting end, it's probably not worthwhile to upgrade. If you're not making significant use of the Cinemachine API, in other words, if you're using it out of the box without any custom scripting surrounding Cinemachine, then the upgrade process will be quite easy. So it depends on the nature of your project. If you've got a big investment in scripts, it's gonna be some work to upgrade. You can do it, and we'd be very happy if you do it, but you don't have to do it. And for those people, really, you can just stay on Cinemachine 2 and it's going to be fine. If you're starting a new project beginning 2023.2, then you will get the new Cinemachine by default, and we would for sure recommend using the new version of Cinemachine for any new project that you would be making.
That's great. Okay, well, hey, let's step right into it and start showing people around the new version of Cinemachine. Okay,
so this is a very simple scene. We have some ground. We have a little character here. I'm in play mode, so I can actually walk the character around. And there are no cameras. Well, there's one camera. There's a Unity camera, but it's just sitting there, right? So first thing you do, you want to create a Cinemachine camera. What is that? That isn't a camera like the Unity camera. It's more of a placeholder that says, hey, when I'm active, put the Unity camera where I am. So let's just make one of those things. You right click here, you go to Cinemachine, and you create Cinemachine camera. You'll notice that that's not a Cinemachine virtual camera, which is what it was called in 2.x. We now call them Cinemachine cameras. As Mark mentioned, because virtual camera has another use in Unity. So we just create that. What does that do? It creates a camera placeholder at the same place your scene view was. So we're mimicking the scene view over here. And I can get you to walk around like that. So now we have a camera. This is just a very simple thing. It's nothing but a transform with a lens, right? So I can adjust the lens here. I can move the transform around. Really, it behaves just like a camera, except it isn't a camera. Why does that matter? Because Unity cares how many cameras you have in your scene. You don't want to just start creating these heavy camera objects and having to manage them with the sound list, the audio listener, and the other stuff that you attach to a camera.
And I just want to point something out. This is something that I think is super helpful for the people coming from earlier versions of Cinemachine to note how simple and uncomplicated the inspector is in this version. We have removed a lot of the standard pieces, they now get added in. And I know you'll go into that in detail later, but I think it's before we move on to the second camera, helpful for people to just note how much we've decluttered the interface out of the box.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mark. I'm already used to this, so I've forgotten about it.
That's why I'm here.
Right. Yeah. So well, there's the transform which we mentioned, and it pretty much consists of a lens. I showed you that I can modify the FOV. If I open up the lens, we have the other settings that you're accustomed to seeing in a camera lens. Down below, we have some other stuff that I will get into later. But for the most part, all you have to worry about if you're just using static cameras is the position and the lens, same as a Unity camera. So let's go make another shot. I've modified the scene view to show what kind of shot I want. We're going to create another camera, and you see what happens. We create that new camera, and the shot blends into the new position. If I deactivate the camera, it's going to blend back to the old position. So that's how you create multiple shots. By activating and deactivating these cameras, Cinemachine will blend from one shot to the other. Okay, so let's get into something a little more complicated. I'm not happy with just a static shot. I now want to make a shot that tracks this character. So what I would do then is right-click on the player and again go to Cinemachine. And now I want to target a targeted camera. And in this case, I want it to be a follow camera. So I'll just click that. It's going to create a new camera which targets this character. Right? So if I walk the character around, you can see that the camera is actually staying in the center of the screen, because the camera is, if we zoom out here, you're going to see that the camera is actually tracking with the player. Jump. Oh, there we go. So,
and just to drive home the point, there's something you did there that we don't do. We don't allow in the 2.x versions of Cinemachine, where you clicked on the target,
yes,
right-clicked, and you were able to make that target, that you basically created a camera and made it a target all in one move.
Right, because we have this new menu called targeted cameras, and we have a few different flavors of target. And what that's going to do, it's going to take the thing you right-click on and set up a Cinemachine camera according to some templates that we've baked in to do some commonly used operations, common kinds of following. So there's 2D following and regular following, excuse me, and Freelooks as well. Now, there's no need to use those menu items to do that. You know, I actually, why don't I just show you? I'll delete that camera. I could just as easily create an ordinary camera, right? And then I can drag the player into the target field of the camera. Let's plop them there. Well, now the camera knows that I'm targeting this, but I haven't defined what I want the camera to do with that information. All right, so to make a follow camera, I would go into position control, and using this drop down, I would select follow. Now, why do I have a fancy drop down here? The only reason is for exposure. So if I click that, all it does is it adds a Cinemachine follow behavior onto this thing. I didn't have to do it that way. I can remove this component and I can add follow. Oh, there it is. Cinemachine follow. Poof. It amounts to the same thing, and you notice that this drop down updates itself. It's dynamically figuring out what you've got. This is just for convenience and exposure. You don't have to remember the names of all these things. You can just find them here. And I also want to, let's say, look at the character. So there we go. So I'm following him. I'm following the character, and I'm looking at the character. It's just what I had before. So those other menus were just a convenient shortcut to make them. So we set a couple of things. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
If I may just jump in on that, I think again, big difference here between old or 2.x versions of Cinemachine and this is, in the old Cinemachine, what you just added, which is a component, a standard Unity component, in the old version of Cinemachine would have been part of the monolith of the Cinemachine virtual camera. Now everything is its own individual component.
Correct. So there were these aim and body sections instead of position control and rotation control, and they were similar drop downs, and that would open up a kind of embedded behavior inside the old virtual camera. So it's no longer an embedded behavior that's implemented in an idiosyncratic way. It's an ordinary behavior, and you can access it from script with get component It's just completely ordinary. It follows all of the patterns. And one of the nice things about that is that you also have these component menus like reset, copy, and paste. You can drag them to other objects. You know, you have all of the things that Unity brings you with the normal component architecture. So we're really taking advantage of that. And of course, you have the presets and you have the prefabs, and they all work properly. You also notice that these behaviors, they don't have a lot in them. In the old days, they were actually quite large. There were quite a lot of sliders and fields and fold outs. So that's one of the things we've done. In addition to restructuring the data itself, we've also restructured the UX to make it a lot less daunting. It's still doing all the same things, but it's presenting it in a way that's I think a little bit easier to grok. You know, you're not going to you're not going to have to hunt around for things as much.
Yeah, the cognitive workload is
yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. So we have the same damping. We have so let's talk about a couple of these things. You notice that I'm going to zoom into the character a little bit. So on the screen, we have these screen guides that are showing you this yellow thing is telling you what is being tracked, the point that's being tracked by the camera. And you see it's down at the feet. And normally the cameras don't want to look at the feet. So into this rotation thing, I would say, actually, don't look at the root of the character, because this player happens to have the root at the feet. I want to say, you know, offset that a little bit. Let's look, you know, right around there, right? So now it's a more normal kind of shot. And I can also adjust where the camera is positioning itself relative to the player root. Right now it's saying, put it the same X and Y, but Z -10. So let's raise the Y a little bit to make it more like a person who's holding a camera, who's following this. And walk around, and then we have, there we go. Jump. Okay, something else that you can see. In the game view, we have these lines and these things that are indicating how the camera is doing the composition. You can turn that off. We have these settings over here called GameView guides, and you can just turn it off altogether, or you can activate them. We have a third setting, which is interactive. What's nice about interactive is that very often you're doing the composition as you're looking at the game view. You don't want to be doing it in the scene view. You want to be seeing what the camera is seeing. So it's nice to be able to have this in the game view. Now I can say, all right, position this guy in the center of the screen, and I have this control over here that says where in the screen to position it. But wouldn't it be much nicer if I could just pick this thing up and drag it? Well, with the interactive game guides, you can do that. You just pick this guy up and drag him around. Similarly, I can drag just the horizontal position or the vertical position as well. So that's just a very nice convenience that we have. That was always there in Cinemachine. It's still there. It's made a little bit nicer because we now, when it's interactive, these things highlight and you can tell what it is you're going to drag. Sometimes people get confused by that. Another thing with the GameView guides that's a little bit different is there used to be quite a lot of numbers here in the rotation composer. We've hidden a lot of well, we haven't hidden them, but we've packaged them a little bit better so that people can understand what's going on. But the basic operation is, I want this thing to be positioned here on the screen, and that takes care of the vast majority of your shots. You want to compose your shot, I want it to be here on the screen, or I want it to be in the center, or what have you.
Let's talk about some of the name changes. We've already discussed the fact that we changed the old Cinemachine virtual camera to the new CM Cam. Talk us through some of these other changes in nomenclature and how we're naming things.
Right. Mostly the name changes, well, pretty much entirely, the name changes are in the kinds of specific procedural components that you can add. So we used to have something called transposer. Nobody knew what that was. Nobody could remember that word. It actually does follow a certain logic. The problem is nobody could remember the word. So we've changed it to follow, which most people understand without further explanation. right? And then we have some variations on follow. We have orbital follow, and we have third person follow, right? And we had something called framing transposer, which was another very difficult thing to remember. It's now called the position composer. Why? Because in the aim section, what was formerly the aim section, the rotation control section, we had something called composer. And we've decided to keep that name because the reference is screen composition. How do you compose your screen? Where do you position your object on the screen? How do you control how quickly the camera catches up? So the damping zones. We have encapsulated all of that concept in the word composer. And you can compose in two ways. You can compose by rotating the camera to get the new shot, but you can also compose by keeping the same rotation and walking to a new place to frame your subject from a new position, but with the same rotation. So those two kinds of composers that do the same thing, they compose your shot in screen space and manage damping and all of that, but they do it with different means, either by rotating or by positioning. So we have a rotation composer in the rotation control section, and we have a position composer in the position control section. So yeah, so I think that covers most of the names there.
I noticed one thing that I noticed in under there is pan tilt. That's a new name, I believe.
Pan tilt, yeah, that used to be called POV. POV was not a great name because it was named after the way we thought people would use it. But it turns out that it's much more useful than just making a point of view camera. And what the thing is really doing is allowing the user through mouse or game controller input or other kinds of input to control the pan and tilt of the camera. So we just renamed it accordingly, right?
Cool.
I think that's it. Yeah. The other thing that's different is tracked dolly, which was a kind of which was a behavior that confined the camera to follow a dolly track, a path. And Cinemachine had implemented all sorts of path code. It's now called spline dolly because what it does is it moves the camera along a spline that you define. And we'll talk more about splines a little bit later.
Sure. Okay. Actually, not so far later. But there is one more name that I wanted to cover, and that is the old collider.
Oh, yes.
We named that as well.
Yeah. So under extensions, we have pretty much all the same stuff we had before, except what used to be called the collider is now called the de-occluder because, well, that's really what it does. It resolves occlusions. And calling it collider was a little bit confusing because Unity has colliders of its own and that do something rather different but related. So we wanted to just make a clear separation of those things.
Okay, cool. Great. So that does, in fact, bring us. You began to talk about dollies and splines. And I think one of the key things we've done here is we have rewritten our old dolly system to use the new splines package. So let's talk about that.
Yes, coming with the latest versions of Unity are the native implementation of splines. Because Unity never had that, Cinemachine made its own versions of splines. And at this point, now that the Unity splines are a real thing, there's really no point having two flavors of splines. So we've abandoned our spline implementation and adopted the new Unity splines, which are actually really quite nice. They have a much better UX. Our own UX was quite primitive. And there is a team that is supporting these things and growing them. And it's just really nice to have that feature become finally a native part of Unity. So let's create a dolly camera with a spline. So whoa. Let us look at the player. Right? Okay, so what did that do? I'm going to just name this a little bit better so that we know, what we've got. This spline camera. And here's our spline. So let's start creating splines. So we're going to add new points. There we go. We're going to start adding points. So how do we create a spline with the new tool? Well, we start clicking. 1, 2. Look at that.
That is so much nicer as a UX than what
Yeah, it is.
Kudos to the team that did this. It's really good.
Yeah. They did a terrific job. And the splines work in all kinds of modes. You can go, and this isn't a tutorial on splines, but by clicking on any of these knots, it exposes a lot of different properties. You can convert these things to linear segments, or you can have them be Bezier segments. You can control the tangents. You can break the tangents. All of the things you would expect in a spline tool, right? So what's nice is that you can just take any spline, which you may be using for other purposes as well, and you can either make a spline specifically to use as a dolly track, or you can take any spline from somewhere else and use it as a dolly track. So we've defined our spline. Let's raise it up off the ground a little bit. And you can see that the camera is positioned on the spline and it's looking at the character. And if I adjust, let's turn this into distance. If I adjust the camera's position along the spline, you can see, oh, there it goes. He's just traveling along the spline and looking at the character. It's pretty much what it was with the splines before, except that it's using moving splines. And similarly, we have Dolly Cart as well. We provided that with our own spline, so we've given the same functionality with the new spline, and we support the same automatic dolly feature that we had before. It's really functionally it's unchanged, but the implementation fits much better into Unity.
That's great, Greg. I think the next area that would be worth looking at, since it's a very popular tool, is the Freelook update. We've done a lot of stuff to the Freelook camera.
Right. In the old days, the Freelook was a separate kind of object, and in fact, under the hood, it was quite a complex thing. It was a conglomerate of 3 independent rigs that got blended into the final output, and that came with, there were a lot of implications to that, because you had to set up 3 rigs and then manage all of the settings on all of those rigs. It ended up being quite a large thing. So if you wanted to say change the screen composition, you would have to do it on all 3 rigs. If you wanted to change the damping, you would have had to do it on all 3 rigs. Then remember that you've done it on all 3 rigs. It was quite a lot of management. And it is a very popular kind of camera. So what is a Freelook? A Freelook is just a follow camera, with the addition that you can control the offset of the camera from the player dynamically with a mouse or with a game controller. And normally you do that to orbit around the player, both horizontally and vertically, to get a free point of view based on the player's position, looking at the player, but from an angle that you can control.
So what games, if somebody watching is like, okay, that was a lot of words, what can you analogize that maybe to some popular games that I'm thinking Zelda, some of the Zelda games do this.
Yeah, you can name the games. I mean, any game that you think of that where you're controlling the point of view. So Zelda is an obvious one.
Okay.
Right. So in the Cinemachine menu, we have I'm going to do it in player. In the Cinemachine menu, you have targeted cameras, and we have Freelook. The new implementation, well, look, a Freelook is just a Cinemachine camera with an orbital follow behavior and a composer, and that's basically it. An orbital follow is an extension of the normal follow just follows from a fixed offset. An orbital follow lets you define a kind of a surface, right? In this case, you've got these three rings. So there's three horizontal orbits, and they're connected by a spline. And by moving the value of the horizontal and vertical axes, what happens is you just travel along the surface that's created by extruding the spline around the character. Right? So that's the domain of your character, of your camera. Your camera's Freelook. So you have these two axes, horizontal and vertical. I said Cinemachine 3 is pretty much no new features. There are some small new features, and here's one of them. We've added a radial axis. What's a radial axis? Well, that's just giving you scale. So people often want to be able to move in or out with their Freelook, and they had to write custom scripts to do that before. Now we've got it built in, so it's just a little bit easier. It's not that you couldn't do it before, it's just easier out of the box right now. A significant change from the old way of doing things is that the old Freelook had, inside these axis definitions, it had the means of controlling them built in. What do I mean by that? It had a place for you to write, okay, what is the input axis? Oh, mouse X, oh, horizontal, vertical. You type that directly in, and these behaviors would query the input system and apply that to let you control. In the new way, we don't do that. All we do is we expose the value, we expose the range, we expose what the recentered position is, and we say, you know what? We expect to be driven. These behaviors are passive in the sense that the axis value is just the input. The camera positions itself according to the axis value, and that's the end of it. That's the job of these behaviors. We've decoupled the reading of the input from the behavior itself. One reason to do that is because, well, since Cinemachine was first published, Unity has come out with a new input system, and it was always a little bit painful to integrate the two. And there's also third-party input systems. There were ways to do it, but it was really had been optimized for the built-in Unity input system, and it was always a little bit awkward to implement the input in a new way. So we've decoupled it, and we expect the input to be driven by an external source, which is good because that source can be a script, that source can be the new input system reading some input actions, that source can be a legacy input system reading the legacy input axes, it could be a third-party thing. It doesn't really matter. One thing that the old 3-rig Freelook gave you, and that was the reason for its existence, was that you might not want all 3 rigs to behave in precisely the same way. It could be that in the top rig, you want to adjust your composition so that maybe you have something that's framed lower in the screen on the top, or when you go down, you might want it to position differently in the camera. You might want it to be to the left or to the right, or maybe you want to adjust the damping differently so that when you're down on the bottom, maybe or you want more noise. You want it to feel more like you're running with these characters, so it's very shaky. But on the top, you want it to be more steady and smooth. So you want it to have maybe different settings depending on your vertical position in the orbit, and that's what the old 3-rig system gave you, because it would interpolate the settings when you're between the rigs. You define it, the settings on each of the 3 rigs, and then it interpolates what's in between. So rather than introduce the complexity of 3 rigs in order to handle, I'm going to just stop the playing. Rather than introduce the complexity of 3 rigs in order to handle this, we thought it was better to keep the basic operation simple. So it's very easy to change your orbits, to set your basic damping and composition that you want. For instance, here in my rotation composer, I want to set my target object offset to be there. I don't want to have to do that 3 times. I want that to be the same everywhere. We decided instead of having 3 separate rigs that it makes more sense to add a new behavior that allows you to perturb certain settings based on where you are in the orbit. So that's the thing called the Freelook modifier. When you create a Freelook using the menu, we give you that thing automatically. We disable it because it's not actually necessary. If you want to have a homogeneous Freelook, you can just delete the behavior. You don't even need it. But if you want to modify based on the vertical position, you can turn that behavior on, and you can add any of these pre-baked modifiers that people tended to use. So we've included a number of items that were getting used by people. Although this is not an exhaustive list, the API is open, so that if you want to change something else based on the vertical position, it's very easy to add your own item to this list. There's an API for that. So for instance, maybe for the top rig and the bottom rig, you want different settings on the lens, right? So the base setting is what's in the middle. Whatever you've got here, like I've defined the lens here in the base camera, that's going to apply for the middle rig. When I add a modifier, let's go modify the lens, it's giving me settings for the top and the bottom. What it does initially, it just copies whatever I had in the middle, and then I can modify it. So maybe on the bottom, on the top, I want to have a little bit of a tilt. I want to say tilt 10 degrees. So I put in a Dutch of 10 degrees, which is going to twist the camera. And now when I go up, whoops, that's horizontal, vertical axis. So going up, what's going to happen is I get a tilt up on top. It's blended between those things. And that's going to work for any of the settings of the lens. So I can change the near clip, the far clip, the FOV, what have you.
That's great. So I think one thing that's really interesting to just note here is as you've continued working, the inspector has gotten more complex. You're adding added behaviors and everything. And I want everyone to just ponder and contrast this with how bare bones and simple this was when Greg started. This is part of this overhaul to the UX we've done to try and make the controls progressively appear as you need them, rather than have everything in your face all at once, which seemed to be quite the cognitive overhead for people starting Cinemachine.
That's right. It was a conscious effort to do that, but it's always a little bit of a tightrope, right? Because if you hide too much stuff, then nobody knows it's there and nobody can find it and nobody remembers how to get it, which is why we've adopted a strategy of we don't show things unless they're actually being used, but at the same time, we make sure that they're easy to locate.
That's great. So with that, why don't we move on to talking about input? Because you guys have done a lot of work to improve how we handle both the, or to make sure we can handle both of the old input, the new input system. Yeah, please give us more about this.
Sure. So I mentioned before that the input axes don't contain any input settings of their own. They simply are very passive. They say what my current value is and what my range is and what the center is. We expect you to add another behavior to drive those input values. So we provide one by default. So when you create a Freelook camera, it's going to give you this thing down here called the input axis controller. So we do provide that. If I were to remove it, right, if I just made my Freelook not from the menu, but just by setting the appropriate things in the camera itself, inside the orbital follow, which is something that is expecting to be driven because it expects input, it gives you a little reminder. It says, hey, you haven't got anything driving these input values. Now, maybe you want that. That's okay, because maybe you have a custom script that's driving it from game logic or from whatever. But we give you a nice shortcut here to simply add one of our input controllers. Now, you don't have to use our input controller. We have an API, and you can write your own input controller. So you're not limited by this. But this thing was designed to play nicely with both the legacy input system and Unity's new input system. And it contains all the same hooks that you had before. So if you had a third-party input system, you can still make it work. Or you can just opt to write your own input controller that's customized for whatever input system you're using. So what this controller does is it finds the behaviors that are exposing axes that need to be driven. In this case, we have horizontal, vertical, and radius. And they get exposed down here as look orbit X, look orbit Y, and orbit scale. That's coming from here. And this is just discovered dynamically. So for instance, if I were to remove the orbital follow and say, do something that doesn't want input, look what happens. The input axes are gone, and the controller says, hey, wait a minute, there's nobody. Hey, there's nobody to drive. I can't find anybody. It's not gonna hurt to leave him there, but it's telling you that it hasn't found anything, any input axes to actually drive. So let's just put all that back. Okay. Now inside, we're going to open this up. You have here the orbit X is being driven by an input action. I actually have both the new input system and the legacy input system installed here, which is not something that most people are ever going to use. Usually you just pick one or the other. I've got them both. It actually works with both. So if I move the mouse X, it's going to take that. If I move whatever action this is, it's going to take that as well. So I've got them both working at the same time. So here you're allowed, here's where you map the input system to the axis, right? And you have various things like gain, which is just a multiplicative thing. If you want to invert it, you would just multiply it by a negative number. So it's just a scale factor. There's legacy input and legacy. That's for the legacy input system. These will disappear if you don't have the legacy input system installed. These things configure themselves based on whatever you've got installed with Unity, right? So you've got the current value of the input. If I don't map this to anything, I just sort of unmap that and unmap the legacy as well. I can just put in a fixed value to the input. So that's as if somebody's always putting in the value of 1 all the time. It's not reading any input. I'm just hard coding, hey, you're always inputting 1 at this point. The system is agnostic where the input is coming from. It really doesn't care. And then you have things like acceleration and deceleration. You can control that, which is similar to how Cinemachine used to behave. And you also have the recentering, which you can enable. Wait is how long it waits before recentering. By wait, I mean how much time has elapsed since the user has last input something. If you just stop moving it, it's going to wait a second, and then it's going to recenter over the time. In this case, it's 2 seconds. So all of your input is controlled like this, and it's pushed into the behavior. And that's, I think, a much cleaner strategy for driving input. And that way, the base of Cinemachine remains agnostic about input systems.
Okay, so Greg, there is another thing we were talking about that's a bit of a difference with Cinemachine 3, and that is relevant to anyone who's using Cinemachine to do split screens or picture-in-picture or mini-maps, that kind of, where 2 cameras are involved. Why don't you show us how that works?
Right. So the way Cinemachine works is you don't have a direct link from the from the Cinemachine camera to the main camera with the brain. What happens is that the brain dynamically detects whatever Cinemachine cameras are present, and using the priority system, it will display the one that it likes best. We do it that way because we don't want to do hard links to support dynamic loading of prefabs or loading of other scenes. And you don't want to have to start messing around with relinking things. So that's why the brain dynamically discovers these cameras. That works great, except in situations when you have split screen. So let me just show you. I'm going to make a second camera. Actually, I've already made it. So we'll just turn that on. And the first one, we'll cut it down. 1.5 and whoops, 0.5. Okay, so now we have two main cameras, each with a brain, and we have one Cinemachine camera. And you can see that that camera is feeding both brains. If I drag the character around, both brains, both main cameras are tracking that because they're being driven by the same virtual camera. Well, I don't want that. I want another virtual camera to drive the second brain. So let me duplicate that, duplicate the second camera. And now, well, they're still both driving the same brain. If I solo the second camera, then both brains end up being soloed. So it's not done yet. In the old days, what we used to do is use the Unity layer system, so that what you do is you would put your Cinemachine cameras on a layer, and then in the camera attached to the brain, you filter the layers so that you can see the cameras that you want and you don't see the cameras that you don't want. And that's a way of channeling, of filtering the cameras so that they go to the right brain. That works fine, except that we had complaints from people saying that, well, you know, there aren't that many Unity layers, and you know, we don't want to use them up. And if I have 3 or 4 cameras on the screen, that's using up a lot of layers that I would like to use for other things. So we've decoupled that and implemented our own dedicated layering system. It works exactly the same way. The difference is that it's just a dedicated layer. So I'll just show you that very quickly. In the main camera, what I do is I set it up. We call our layers channels. So we have a channel mask here in the brain, and I set that up. Instead of just looking at the default channel, I'll say, look at channel 1. I can tell it to look at multiple channels if I want, same as layers. It's like a layer mask, but in this case, I'll just set it to 1. So this camera looks at channel 1. This camera looks on channel 2. And now, because the brains are no longer looking at the default channel, whoop, you see the cameras are no longer feeding the brains, right? They're just static right now. So now I have to go to the cameras and say, all right, I want you, camera. I have to enable priority in channel because I'm not using the default system. So instead of the default channel, I want you to output to channel 1. And for you, let me just, yeah, for you, I want you to output to channel 2. Boom. Okay, and just to see that these are different cameras, let's fix this. Let's have this guy look from the front and maybe a little bit higher up. There we go. Right? So now if I move the player around, the 2 cameras are tracking. Camera 1 is feeding brain 1, camera 2 is feeding brain 2. That's it.
That's great. Thanks, Greg. I think that that's a really nice addition and makes that whole process much easier to understand, I think. Okay, cool. I think what we've covered here now is kind of all the main pieces about Cinemachine 3 itself and what it is, how it works, kind of what some of the differences. One important thing that we need to cover is we said at the top, in general, we think if you're in the middle of a project, you're using Cinemachine 2, you probably want to stick with it. You can upgrade though, and since you can, why don't we show them a bit about how?
Okay, so I think the easiest way to do that is to install some stuff that's using the old version of Cinemachine. And I've actually, let's get them here. I've got them here. Got a bunch of old samples from Cinemachine 2. So let's just install those. This isn't a perfect example because the scripts have already been changed to work. So the big gotchas that you have, if you just have a project that was written with old Cinemachine and you install new Cinemachine, if you have custom scripts that are using the API, they will very likely no longer compile. Why? Because parameter names have changed, because in some cases class names have changed, various parts of the API have changed. So if you decide you want to do that, that your scripts aren't so complicated that you're going to bite the bullet and just upgrade them, what you would have to do is when you install the new Cinemachine, the first step is to go through all the places where you're seeing compile errors and just fix them. And usually that's going to be really, really simple. It's a matter of ticking off the M underscore if you're referring to a member, or maybe if you're referring to one of the classes that has been renamed, just change the name. It's a fairly small list of these things. We have an upgrade guide that lists them, and it's pretty straightforward to that. In this case, the console is your friend. It's going to point you to all the spots where you're having trouble. There's also a bunch of APIs that are deprecated and classes that are deprecated. You can see here in the console, these old samples are using a bunch of those. And it's getting warnings that they're deprecated and telling you, oh, just change it to this new class. In this case, look, Cinemachine Composer is obsolete. It has been replaced with Cinemachine Rotation Composer, right? It's just telling you what to do. Follow all those things and you should be up and running fairly quickly, at least as far as the scripts are concerned. The other issue is that the data itself has changed. So the old virtual camera, it hasn't just been renamed, it's been rewritten. It's a new class. There's the old composer, well, there's a new class, it's the rotation composer. And these are actually different things. The splines, right? There's the old paths, and now there's new things, which are splines. We have kept all the old code. So modulo a few renames, all the old code is still present in deprecated form. So your scenes, and I've got my old samples here. I'm going to open up one of them. Let's say Freelook character. See, right? So we have here the old Freelook, and it's still there. Cinemachine Freelook. You can see that it's deprecated, and it's got all of the old API with the top rig, middle rig, and bottom rig. All of these aim, body, and noise, they're all still there. So it'll still work. You're going to get deprecation warnings, but once you've upgraded your scripts so that they're building, your old stuff should still just work. The next, you could just live like that. I don't see what the point is. You might as well have stayed with Cinemachine 2 if you're going to do that. The next step is to upgrade the data itself. That's like a fairly complicated thing, because if your project uses prefabs or if it has animations or timelines, there's all kinds of references. There's all kinds of prefab instances and instance overrides that all have to get fixed up. So you can't just fix up the prefab and then expect all the prefab instances to magically work, right? You have to systematically open all of the scenes in the project. You have to open all the prefabs in the project. You have to edit all of the timeline assets in the project, the animation assets in the project. It's a big operation. So we've written a tool to help you do that. And the way to access the tool is to go into any inspector for virtual camera or Freelook. I'm talking about the old versions. And you can see it says deprecated here. And it's giving you a little access to our upgrade tool. Whoops. Click on that. And that's your access to the Cinemachine Upgrader. So there's several things you can upgrade. You've got three options here. You can either, just to see what's going on, you can upgrade only this camera. The first option here will take this particular camera that you're inspecting, and it will upgrade it to the new data format. Right? That's worth trying. So you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to click on it. Press that. And it's converted my Freelook to a Cinemachine camera with an orbital follow, rotation composer, the new input axis controller, and it's set up all of the settings to mimic the old one as best it could. And generally, we cover most of the cases. There are a few edge cases that we don't handle entirely, but those are expected to be very rare. And in that case, it'll tell you what it couldn't upgrade, and then you can decide what to do. So what's nice about that is that it's a completely undoable operation. You can see I can run the scene to see if it still works. It does. Let's undo that. So I undo. We're going to get back to the old one. The next option I can pick is to upgrade the entire scene. So I've got a number of cameras in here. As long as you don't have prefabs or animation assets that are part of this scene, go ahead, upgrade the scene. It'll just go and it'll do all the cameras. It's done. And similarly, you can undo that. So that just covers only the simplest of scenes. Most projects are going to be more complicated than that. They're going to have prefabs, they're going to have animations, they're going to have all kinds of things. In that case, what you have to do, now I've imported a whole bunch of scenes from my old samples. So I can show you a case of this. I can just say, upgrade the entire project to Cinemachine 3. So it's going to give you a big scary warning, which says, make a backup because we can't undo this. It's going to have to open all of your scenes. It's going to have to open all of your prefabs, all of your assets. It's going to open them multiple times because it's got to keep track of references and things like that. And then it's going to save them multiple times. There's no way you can undo this. So make a backup, right? Right. So this is, as I said, it's a long operation. It's got to open up all the scenes and make several passes in order to fix up all the references correctly. It takes a little time, but it's a lot faster than doing it manually. There you go. So, and we're going to go back to that scene. Right. So now what it's done, it's upgraded everything, and it's given you, in the cases there were some things it couldn't quite upgrade, it's gonna let you know what it did and what the problems were, right? So in this case, it's telling you, oh, you can't do that, and you can find in the logs what it couldn't upload.
So this kind of goes to the point that upgrading is, we have a tool that helps, but it's not going to be perfect, and it'll help you get there. But if you have a project that you're deeply in, unless there's something you see in Cinemachine 3 that you just have to have, you're probably as well to stick with Cinemachine 2 for now.
Yep. I mean, don't do work just for the sake of doing work. There's certainly nothing wrong with upgrading, but if you don't need to, why spend the effort?
Great. So Gregory, that was terrific. I think there's one last piece of information people need. So we are here early in November of 2022. And the question that I'm sure is on at least a few people's minds is, okay, great. I definitely want this for my next project, or I want to try it out. How are they going to go about getting it and when?
Right. So it is currently available in pre-release. You have to click the right buttons in the package manager to expose the pre-release packages. But we have a minimum Unity version of 22.2. It won't work prior to that because we're using a bunch of new APIs like splines and everything. And at a certain point, there's only so much conditional compiling that you want to put into a product. So we're taking advantage of this major revision change to do a bit of cleanup. We've been supporting Unity all the way back to, well, right now it's 2019.1. Prior to that, we did a previous cutoff when there were significant package manager changes to Unity. So we had to stop supporting things that were too old. So yeah, we took advantage of this time to just make a clean break. Anything before 22.2, too bad. You can use Cinemachine 2. So starting in 2023.1, it will be available in pre-release, and it will be the default in 23.2.
Will you be able to get, if for some reason you're creating a version in 23.1, but you'd rather stick with the old version of Cinemachine, will that still be possible?
Yes. So if, for instance, you're using assets that you made for another project or that you got off the asset store that are assuming a certain version of Cinemachine, instead of having to upgrade all that stuff, yeah, you can install an older version. We do intend to fully support that for a while.
Okay, and I think maybe put an exclamation against for a while. There will eventually come a time, of course, where we will want to move everyone to Cinemachine 3, but they'll have quite a bit of time. And because of how Unity supports backwards compatibility for 2 years, I think you can reasonably assume that your Cinemachine 2 projects are safe for quite some time.
Yes, minimum 2 years.
Right.
I'm pretty sure we're going to support it a little bit longer, only because there's so much content out there that's been made with Cinemachine, and we don't want to invalidate all of that, right? Just because we've decided to bump our version.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. Well, hey, with that, Gregory, I just want to thank you for giving us all like this super deep dive on everything that Cinemachine 3 is about and helping us understand it. Hopefully everybody has learned something and enjoyed and are excited, that they're excited to see the new stuff. I certainly am. So thank you for all of that.
Well, thanks for setting this up, Mark. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay, great. And with that, everybody, take care.